Everybody. Hi, we're running a couple minutes behind because the other presenter's stuck in traffic, but he's on his way here. He promised us he's on his way here. So should I just introduce you or should I?
Well,
Okay.
he's just going to have to jump in.
He's just going
as
to jump
we're
in.
going.
All right.
We're not going to stop for him.
It's like a moving train.
It is.
Yeah. Anyways, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us here tonight for this presentation. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Holly Ward Lamb and I'm the director here at the Hell Carnegie District Library. I have 3 housekeeping items since I have all of your attention. Number 1, if you need the restroom, they're down the back hall. It's not school, you can get up and leave at any point in time. At the end of the program, you'll actually exit through what we call the Clinton Street entrance, AKA the back doors, because the main part of the library will be closed. It closes at 7. To keep up to date on all library events, please follow us on Facebook or check our website, www.howelllibrary.org. Yes, there were 3 L's in a row. If you did not grab some coffee, cookies, or water, and did not notice the very cool new chip clips with the magnet, I am just so easily impressed. Please, if you have any use for a Howell Library chip clip and magnet, help yourself. Okay, but on to the reason that we are all here tonight. Nolan Finley, who got here on time, but we won't make a big deal out of that. Is a product of the Detroit News and the Detroit community. He graduated from both Schoolcraft College and Wayne State University. He is the Detroit News editorial page editor and also co-host of One Detroit on Detroit Public Television. Steve Henderson, who will be here any moment now, is a native of Detroit, a graduate of University of Detroit Jesuit High School and the University of Michigan. In 2020, he founded Bridge Detroit, where he serves as the executive editor. And Henderson is co-host of One Detroit and host of American Black Journal on Detroit Public Television. But on to the reason we're actually here. Americans used to engage in civil conversation with people of opposing viewpoints, enjoying the banter and debate. Too many Americans believe that they cannot be friends with people whose politics are different. Nolan Finley and Stephen Henderson founded the Civility Project in 2020 to bring people with opposing viewpoints together and teach them the tools to have civil conversations, explore civic discourse without animosity, and learn how to listen productively. The program grew out of their unusual and unlikely friendship as they figured out how they had built a successful and productive relationship while holding opposing perspectives on almost everything. Is there anything you guys agree on? Okay.
Certainly not start time.
My guess is they both have really good senses of humor. Otherwise, it's going to be ugly in about 10 minutes. At the core of the Civility Project is the belief that incivility is both unproductive and potentially dangerous. Civility requires seeing another person as a human beyond their political stance and trying to understand where they're coming from. So please welcome one half of the dynamic duo.
So I will say that I drove here straight from Lexington, Kentucky, and I got here 45 minutes early. So I don't know what Steve's excuse will be when he arrives, but he will arrive. So so while we wait for him, I'll explain the Civility Project and how it came to be and what our mission is with this. Actually, it was not a light bulb moment where Steve and I got together and said, hey, let's start this Civility Project and talk to people about how they can work past their differences and have a productive relationship. I mean, it sort of evolved organically over a great deal of time. I started I've been at the news 47 years, and and so when he arrived, a lot of folks, I was already doing a lot of television, a lot of public appearances. Steve started doing that, and folks radio, maybe they'd fight. We could all enjoy watching it, and so and that's pretty much what we did. We got invited to do a lot of public appearances to do sort of a point counterpoint programs, and we'd get pretty intense in those uh, situations. I don't know, where I grew up with, as little boys, we used to enjoy catching crayfish and putting them in a jar and watch them tear each other apart, as sadistic little boys will sometimes do. And that was pretty much what this was like. And so people made some assumptions about our relationship and who we were. And they just assumed two people who went after it as ferociously as we did couldn't possibly have any sort of personal affection for each other or a friendly relationship. But the more we fought, the more we seemed to enjoy each other's company beyond that, outside of the arena, if you will. And we didn't think anything of it. I mean, the way I came up in the business, that it wasn't uncommon to see people who fought sort of and argued and were bitter antagonists or passionate antagonists on the public stage and in their public role could enjoy great friendships. Recall talking about this with the late Representative John Dingell, who was very dear to me. And, he would talk about, he was obviously a very powerful Democrat in Congress, but he'd talk about all the time he'd spent in, hunting and dining with the people on the other side of the aisle, with Republicans, and the very close relationships they built that allowed them in circumstances to work together. And, it used to not be uncommon, but starting around that same period when Steve arrived in Detroit, about 2007 and 2008, that whole crisis era we were in, politics started to change. And politics started to change in a very unpleasant way. And our political interactions started to change. We weren't simply people who disagreed. We were people who couldn't abide one another, who couldn't stand the fact that we disagreed. And it's got, it got worse and worse and worse. And so, somewhere around 2014, 2015, Steve and I decided to, people were noticing our friendship and saying, how could you be friends with that guy? How could you talk with that guy? How could you be close to a person whose views are so aberrant, in their view? And so we started to think about it, and we thought, well, maybe it'd be fun to bring groups of conservatives, groups of liberals, groups of his friends, groups of my associates together, and just ask them to talk to each other, get to know each other, and let them see, what's possible if they leave their assumptions at the door. And so we started doing this, and both he and I have a tremendous affection for bourbon whiskey. I was born and raised in Kentucky. Steve worked in Kentucky at the Lexington Herald Leader for a number of years, and he had the liquor barn cater his wedding back when he was working there. He was such a aficionado of bourbon. So we we started these bourbon nights, we called them, in the back room of local bars, and there'd be 20, 25 of us, evenly divided group. And we asked people just one thing when they came in the door. First, to put 20 bucks in the jar to pay for the bourbon, but second, to single out somebody who didn't think like you thought. There you go. I'm about done, Steve. We're about to the thank you for joining us. Oh, so we did this.
Relief is here.
So we began putting these groups together and just asking them not to argue, but to make a sincere effort at getting to know each other. And our objective was that, and our belief was that if we could get people past the assumptions they make about each other, they could see the good in each other. They could see the positive things that come out of a relationship like that. And so these bourbon nights grew from 15, 20, 25 people to, pretty close to 100 people. And finally somebody said, you guys ought to take this on the road. And, we got a couple sponsors, Huntington Bank and Delta Dental of Michigan thought it'd be worthwhile to sponsor to make this a more formal project. And so we've been doing that now for 2 or 3 years. Actually 3 or 4 years, I guess. Did it all through COVID, and we have taken this program to about 150 groups over that time, all over the state, all over the area, all over the country. And what's impressed us, and again, we're very impressed with this crowd tonight, but what's really gratified us is the appetite we're seeing for civility. I think Americans recognize there's something wrong with our politics, and there's something wrong with our society when people can't sit across the table with someone they disagree with politically and are unwilling to do so. Before the last election, I saw a poll that said 72% of Americans said they didn't talk politics with someone from the other party. They just avoided the subject. They wouldn't take that risk. And so, we are very gratified that folks recognize how dangerous this is to our country, because, it's not simply anymore that we disagree with each other. Our disagreements lead us to hate one another. And there are a lot of forces out there who profit from keeping us fearful and hateful of one another and keeping us divided. And so this project is aimed in a very small way at telling people that you can sort of get past your fears of associating with someone different than you, your assumptions, and have a civil and productive conversation or even relationship with people you wouldn't have thought that was possible of previously. So I'm going to take a drink of water and let Steve jump in.
You've been going this whole time?
I had a couple cookies.
Speaking of incivility, the roads here in Southeast Michigan inspire all kinds of incivility. No, I'm sorry that I am late, but for the record, I left Detroit at 4:30, so I should have made it. I took 23 up. I went over to Ann Arbor and took 23 up because I figured I'd avoid the construction on 96. Big mistake. Anyway, I'm glad to be here.
That's why you have such a good crowd tonight. These people are stuck from last week. You want to take a chance,
right? So I'm sure Nolan has told you lots about why we're doing this and what we're up to. I always kind of start with going back, though, to the time when Nolan and I met, when I came home to Michigan from the East Coast, and I was the editorial page editor at the Detroit Free Press. He's the editorial page editor at the News, and it was 2007. And if you think about what was happening in the country then. We were about to have a presidential election the next year, and it was a pretty contentious election, and the outcome of that election was pretty divisive. A lot of people were really excited that Barack Obama was going to be the first African-American president, and a lot of people were really upset about that and not very happy. But if you fast forward from that date 8 years, right, to 2016, and think about the presidential election that year, same thing, right? Lots of people were really excited that Donald Trump was going to be the president, and lots of other people were not. But there was something fundamentally different about the way many people reacted to that election. I can remember so clearly in the few weeks between the election and Thanksgiving, the number of conversations I had, the number of people who called or wrote letters and said that they were really anxious about Thanksgiving dinner, that for the first time, people were thinking about not going because there was going to be somebody there who voted for the other person, right? Whoever you voted for, there was going to be somebody there who did something different, and you didn't want to have an argument about it. You didn't want to have a fight about it. And if you fast forward from that point to where we are now, we just got through the midterm elections. We got another presidential election coming up. I also, I feel like the constant election cycle drives incivility, right? How are we talking about a presidential election that is more than 18 months away? It's on the news every night. But if you think about where we are now, it's not better than it was in 2016. If anything, things are worse. I mean, and I think one of the things that's happened is that we've settled into this new pattern where each election is a flashpoint, and where the aftermath means that we just don't deal with each other. We don't talk to each other anymore. But that's almost 16 years of time, and over that time, Nolan and I have managed to hold it together. We disagree quite frequently about elections and policy and the things that happen, but we've been able to stay friends. But just as important, we're able to have these kinds of discussions. We are able to have these kind of arguments, and I always say, this is not an exercise in like kumbaya or everybody just kind of agreeing to go along to get along. We have really fundamental differences, and we get after each other. If you've seen us on TV or heard us on the radio, I mean, we don't hold back. But the reason that we're able to do that, the reason that we're able to have these kind of passionate arguments, is because of the things that we've learned over that 15, 16 years, and the things that I think we have kind of adopted as rules, some of them unspoken and unconscious, some of them quite conscious, and practices that keep us from ever getting up from an argument and saying, you know what, I'm done with this guy. I'm not going to come back and do this again. And so that's what we try to share in these sessions is the things that we have figured out to do to be able to maintain that kind of relationship.
And as Steve said, it's not getting better. It's not going to get better in this election cycle. Much more likely to get worse. And we sort of in our politics today have defaulted to trying to scare. Our politicians have defaulted to trying to scare folks rather than sell them on a vision, sell them on the idea. That struck me in listening to the Biden's video announcement of his reelection the other day. It's how quickly he morphed into trying to fear Margaret. If you don't elect me, then the other guys are going to, do all sorts of horrible things, rather than sell folks on ideas. And it must be working, or they wouldn't do it. But it's destructive for our country. And as I said in a few minutes ago, there are forces who profit very well from our division and from keeping us from crossing that gap, crossing that divide. You see it on television every night, the cable television every, every night. You see it in the way our politicians are constantly, talking about, we're going to go fight, and nobody's talking about, well, we're going to go down there and get together and get some real things done. It's always this language of conflict and division. And, on a personal relationship basis, we're in a lot of cases doing the same thing. It's come to offend us now, and we feel personally harmed if someone we know or someone we encounter feels differently. We take that very personally, and it upsets us to a degree that's somewhat irrational. And so as we've worked through this relationship over the last 15 years or what have you, we've come up with some guidelines, some tips that we try to follow. Not always successful. I mean, we are not angels up here. I mean, and I have struggled with civility many times. I will be the first to admit I am not a naturally civil person, and I often have to check myself and remind myself of these principles we're going to be talking about tonight. And I think the overarching principle of the Civility Project is that we believe all good people come to their opinions in the same way. They take the facts, the information available, run them through the filter of their own experiences and values, and come up with a viewpoint. If it's different than yours, if it's different than mine, it doesn't make them evil or sinister or they're out to destroy the country. It means they have had different experiences and hold different values based on those experiences. And we ask as a first step, if there's someone you feel that you find value in having a relationship with or conversation with, but are afraid, to broach that divide, the first thing we ask is that you do sit down together. We talked about what we had folks do during the Bourbon Nights way back when. Sit down and find out what those experiences are, what those values are. Have a conversation with someone that has nothing to do with what they believe, but everything about why they believe. What makes you a conservative? What makes you a liberal? What makes you in the middle? What are the experiences that have shaped your viewpoints? Steve and I did this ourselves, probably a little too late, but we did this ourselves several years ago. Steve's radio host for NPR, and NPR brought their little story corps Winnebago, very cute little camper, to Detroit, parked it on the DIA grounds, and asked folks to talk to each other. And so we did that.
Yeah, and so StoryCorps, for people who don't know, is this national project that NPR runs to kind of collect American stories about relationships. You go down there with somebody that you've known for a long time or have a close relationship with, and you sit across the table with two microphones, and you sort of talk about that relationship and how it started and why it matters. Most people take like a spouse or a family member and do this. But when they said they were coming to Detroit, the first thing I thought was, I'm taking Nolan with me down to StoryCorps. And, on the way, I told him, I said, I don't want us to go in there and do what we normally do, which is have an argument about politics or policy or something like that. I actually want us to just go and tell each other our stories. Right? We had been working together for about 10 years at this point. And I said, I want you to tell me what makes Nolan Finley a conservative. What are the experiences that you had, things that you've learned that tell you that this is the right way to solve problems? And when you're done, I'll do the same thing. I'll tell you what makes me a liberal or a progressive or whatever label you want to put on it, and I'll tell you about the experiences that I've had that lead me to believe that that's the right way to solve things. And so we did that, and you know, we'd been working together for 10 years. We'd been friends for 10 years. We both, I think, learned astonishing things about each other that we did not know, things we had not heard from the other person before. Some of those things helped explain the differences between us. Some of those things also highlighted some commonalities that we didn't know we had, experiences that maybe were similar, or values that we held really dear, and why, and sort of a common thread between those things. And so when we were done, you know, I think the exchange between us fundamentally changed as well. I think if you were to go back and look at or listen to kinds of arguments we had before this, and then listen to us now, you would see a difference. I think there is a deeper understanding of each other. There's a deeper respect, I think, for the positions that the other person holds, because we really do understand why they think that. I think, you know, for a long time, Nolan maybe thought I was just trying to get his goat, saying things that I did, or
I thought there was a little bit wrong.
Right. You know, I think we now know that these come from really deep-seated places, and I think you know, the other thing that's true is the respect is built around the idea that I think we both understand much more about the fact that both of us really want many of the same things to happen. We want people to be successful. We want people to have opportunity. We want things to be fair. We have really different ideas about how you get to those places. I mean, really different ideas about how you get to those places. But in the end, that's more of a shared value than it is in opposition. And sitting there, telling these stories to each other, got us to that place. And so I immediately wondered, what if we had started the relationship that way? What if in 2007, instead of, you know, showing up on a TV set and screaming at each other, we had actually sat down and just had a conversation about who we were and what we believed. I think the whole thing might have, the arc of the whole thing might have gone in a really different direction.
And so, you know, out of this process, I mean, this is a step, this process of getting to know someone and understanding their motivations and why they believe what they believe. It's an important step in breaking down assumptions. And, you know, we all do this. We hear something about someone, a little piece of information, and we take that and make very large assumptions about who they are. So you voted for that person or the other, and you know, your little computer in your head is, you know, running all of these, you know, standard programs telling me who you are, or who I believe you are. And, you know, we all do it. We make assumptions about how we feel about someone well before we've taken the time to actually talk to them and get to know them. And we were up, Steve and I were up on Mackinac Island several years ago for the Michigan Republican Party state convention. And, you know, we're both covering it. I was probably a little more comfortable than Steve was that weekend.
I was really, really popular on the island that weekend.
But we were, you know, we sitting in a bar after the day's sessions, just, you know, having a couple of whiskeys, and I get up to use the restroom. The bar's crowded with convention attendees. I'm walking across the bar, and these two ladies stopped me. You know, they were conservative activists. I knew them well. They jumped me and said, "Is that Steve Henderson you're talking to over there?" I said, "Yeah." And they says, "How could you be friends with him? He's just awful. We hate him." and something about that just jarred me. And we've all said that when we've heard somebody on the television, somebody on the radio. Oh, I hate that guy. They said we just hate, and there was such vitriol in it. They really did hate you. And I could have said, I'm not that crazy about him myself, but instead, I said, okay, my seat's open, and go over there and talk to Steve, and just tell him what it is that he's done that has so offended you, and just ask him, whatever questions you have, he'll talk to you. And so they did that, and I've been hanging around talking to other people. About an hour and a half later, I said, well, we got to get out of here. And I go over, and I had to just drag Steve away from these two ladies. And as we're leaving, I turned to him, I said, okay, what do you think? He's just wonderful. We love him. And I'm like, I know for a fact in that hour and a half, nothing about Steve changed. Nothing about his opinions changed. Nothing about these ladies changed. Nothing about their opinions changed. What changed was they took time to talk to each other. And they dropped some of the assumptions and asked the why question. Why did you write that? Why do you feel that way? What's your story? And that sort of became the genesis of this, or started putting in our minds that there are ways you can do this.
I mean, and what they were upset about, this was a long time ago, was during the auto bankruptcy. I had been writing strongly in favor of the reorganization and the things that they were trying to do to get GM and Chrysler, through it. And one of these women was from a family that owns dealerships, and they were among the dealerships. Some of their dealerships were among the ones that they were talking about closing. And so this kind of brings us to the next principle. That first principle is, drop the assumptions. But our second principle is set reasonable expectations when you sit down to have these kind of conversations. If they had come over and just decided they wanted to yell at me about the things that I'd written, I'm not sure we would have gotten very far. But they took Nolan's advice, and they said, here's the things that you're doing that we disagree with and we find quite hurtful. They explained to me the pain that their families were feeling because of this. If I had sat there and figured, well, I'm not going to back down at all, I'm going to put these two people in their place and show them that they're wrong, we wouldn't have gotten very far either. But I didn't. I sat and I listened, and it really was the first time I had heard from somebody who was that close to that part of the issue. And so we were able, again, not to come to agreement. I didn't change what I was writing about the bankruptcy. They certainly didn't change their opinion about the things that were happening. But I think we had a better understanding of why we each believed the things that we did. And we were able to have that conversation and not expect to win. No one was trying to convince the other person that they were right or wrong. It was just an exchange that left both of us more knowledgeable, I think, about what the other side believed. And so we talk a lot about when you have these kinds of disagreements, when you have these kind of discussions, that is the goal. The goal is to actually learn more about what the other side of the issue thinks, how they come up with their opinions, and maybe walk away with a slightly enhanced understanding of the issue overall, because you did listen to the other person.
And we say a conversation is not a competition. And too often when we engage with someone, our goal is to, as Steve said, just to beat them into the ground and impress them with our superior intellect, and nobody likes to be preached to. And so conversation is designed, or should be designed, to gain knowledge, gain understanding. I'm not going to agree with Steve, and yet we talk several times a week, about difficult issues. I'm not going to convert him. If I did, my heart would probably stop and be my last day. he's not going to convert me, but we learn something in the exchange. I mean, we might not change a thing about our opinion. We may sharpen our own opinions through the exchange. Uh, we may broaden our views somewhat. I mean, we're not trying, to settle it all and become the same, person, if you will. But we do get value out of it. So decide what that value is that you're seeking. And it should be to gain more understanding, to gain more knowledge, rather than to win, because you never win in that situation. People walk away with hard feelings, and resentment. And as part of that, we also say, check your self-righteousness at the door. You come in thinking, you're the one with all the answers, and the other person's opinion is not valid. And you're going nowhere with that, too. Everybody thinks they're the only ones who talk to God. And so you should understand when you sit down across from somebody, that person thinks they're the only one who talks to God, too. And, understand that they are as committed to their opinions as you are to yours. And so, don't get all smug and high and mighty and self-righteous. Come with an honest heart and those honest goals.
And so then the third principle that I think we've learned a lot about over the last 15 years is once you drop the assumptions and set a reasonable expectation for this kind of exchange, you actually got to listen to the other person. And we use that word a little differently, I think, in the Civility Project than most of us use it in our everyday lives. I think most of us would say if we're not talking, we're listening. If we're letting the other person talk, then we're listening. But I think we ask ourselves a little more about that, I think we find ourselves not always listening when we're letting someone else talk. Sometimes when Nolan is talking, I'm thinking, when's he going to be quiet? So I can say what I want to say next, or I'm judging what he's saying while he's talking, or I'm thinking about what I just said to him before and why it didn't seem to make any difference, and he's still saying the same thing. Well, that's not the kind of listening we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about really making an investment in what the other person is saying and the idea that there is some value to be gained for us from what they're saying, and really giving them a chance to explain why they think what they think in addition to what they think. And so I have a couple of tests for myself that tell me when I'm really actually listening. The first is when the other person's done, I ask myself whether I could repeat back what they said, maybe not word for word, but in good faith, really represent where they're coming from as though I were them. Could I become Nolan for 5 minutes and make these absurd arguments about politics and policy? And then the second test I have for myself is, do I have questions for that person? I find that when I am really listening to somebody, I do have questions when they're done. Maybe they said something that I didn't quite get. Maybe they said something I hadn't heard before, didn't know they believed. Maybe they said something that I'm just really curious about. And so one signal, I think, of that investment that we're asking people to make is that curiosity. What questions do you have for them? Not about what you think, but about what they think. How much more do you actually want to know about who they are and how they come up with the things that they're saying?
I think then beyond that is you have to commit to the long term here. This is not a short-term process. You're not going to get this right the first conversation, usually. I mean, this is something you have to commit coming back to, knowing when to break it off when things become, a little ugly, and saying, hey, we'll do this again next week. Committing to the relationship long term and learning to get it right, I think is very, very critical to this, as is, figuring out the right time and place to do it. There's places and and moments that are less tense, that are less fraught than others. Pick the safer places, and give the person you're talking to a little slack or a lot of slack. You're not there waiting to pounce on something somebody says if they get something wrong. Make sure they know they can say what they feel like saying, that they can express themselves, and you'll talk through it. You're not there to like ruin their lives if they make a slip of the tongue.
Yeah, I call this, acting where you have agency, and I think there's a really important principle here. I think we live in a time right now where a lot of people feel very frustrated by the things that we see around us and kind of helpless to change them. I always go back to January 6th of 2021, and no matter what your politics are, who you voted for, I think most of us sat watching the television that day, horrified by what was going on, and feeling as though the people who were doing what they were doing were kind of beyond our grasp. Right? These aren't necessarily people that we know. They have reached a point where they feel like this is the only way they can be heard, and it's a sign of the system kind of breaking down. And I felt like, what am I supposed to do about this? I mean, what is it that I am doing or I'm not doing that could have an effect on this? But I think that's not what most of us need to be focused on. I think we need to be focused on the places where we do have an influence, right? I said earlier that, I hear all the time right now from people who are estranged from people in their families because of politics. They don't go to holiday dinners. They don't go to other things with their families because they can't talk about politics. Well, you have an opportunity there, right? That is your family. The closest people in the world to you, or they're supposed to be. Find a way to reach out to those folks and be able to have these kind of discussions. I have this aunt and uncle who spend all day watching Fox News and listening to conservative radio. Then they spend all night sending me emails and text messages about all the stuff that they've learned. Right? Now, I could very easily say that's, I don't want to talk to them, can't deal with them. But in the last few years, I've really learned to kind of reach out to them and be interested in these things that they're sending me and find a way to be able to actually have a conversation about it. I'm not going to convince them that they're wrong. They're not going to convince me that they're right. But we're family, and we should be able to have that conversation, and we should be able to have it without coming to blows about what they're saying. That's the kind of thing that I think we're talking about doing. And with Nolan and I, very early on, I think one of the ground rules was neither one of us ever just kind of walks away, right? Partially because this was part of our jobs. We were working. We didn't have the option of just walking away all the time. But I think that has become a much more conscious commitment on our part. That even when we bitterly disagree and have a fight, a public fight, neither one of us ever says that's it. I can't do this anymore, or I won't. And I think again, acting where we have the ability to do that and trying to reach out and reach across to people who we have access to. Think of your school community or your neighborhood or your religious community if you belong to one. These are the places that I think each of us has real power and real opportunity to make things better, to make all of this work in a way that doesn't alienate so many folks.
And we'll just take some questions by saying that this is important. Civility is important. It's not important that we all come to some sort of agreement. It's never going to happen in this country. From day one, we've had vigorous divisions and debate in this country, and dissent here. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to passionately disagree. It's not okay for those disagreements to lead to hatred. And, you know, I've been around, obviously, a long time. I've seen the country in bad spots before. I've seen the country at each other's, where we've been at each other's throat before. This has a different feeling for me. This has a coming apart feeling for me. We've become so committed to our disagreements and so determined to win at all costs that we're starting to destroy the institutions that have allowed us to come this far. And that's a dangerous place. You can't change the map. You're not going to go down there and fix Washington. Steve and I aren't going to go down there and fix Washington or Lansing or any other place. But what we can do is set example in our own lives, in our own circles of civility. And, you know, again, civility doesn't mean, you know, we've all become very passive, you know, sheep or whatever. We scream at each other, but we don't hate each other. You know, we never cuss each other. We never call each other names. We mind our Sunday school lessons, but we still disagree, and it's okay. It's okay to disagree. It's not okay to hate each other because we disagree. So we'll stop there and take questions if you all have them. And I'm told I need to repeat the question, so I'll do that. Let's start with him right here. Yeah. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord, have mercy. Yes. Yeah, you can tell. Yeah. And the question is, do we ever feel ourselves needing to say time out, walk? Absolutely. I mean,
that's a great tool, by the way, to use, right? It signals to the other person that you're still interested and you're not walking away, but you just need a breather, right? Oh no. We were talking about appropriate and inappropriate places for political talk. Which one is that? Which list is that on?
Yeah. I mean,
I'm in the jacuzzi. That would have been a good. I don't want to talk about politics here.
That happens to all of us. I was sitting at went over to the club we both belonged to in Detroit, and was sitting at the bar by myself, intentionally reading the newspaper, trying to unwind from a day. And a guy I knew, had known for a long time, not close, but he sat down kitty corner from me, and he says, "Well, what do you think about this?" And I don't remember what the issue was. And I said, "Okay." You know, and I told him what I thought. And he immediately reared up and said, "Oh, you're full of it." I'm like, I was minding my own business. You know? So it happens. Sir, back here, I think you were next. Yeah. I think that's where I mean, the question was, do we see any hope? And I would look at this room, and we speak to groups, um, you know, weekly, and the appetite is there for civility. People don't want to be this divided. And I think as long as folks like yourself come out here on a beautiful Wednesday night, take your time, talk about civility, uh, that's where the hope lies. I don't feel like, most Americans believe we're in a good place. They do want better.
That's a great question, and I have a pessimistic answer. I don't see a lot of hope, but I always also answer that question by identifying some of the things that I think are making it worse, and talking about the things that I think we might try to do differently. We didn't talk much about social media tonight, but I mean, a lot of the fuel for incivility, I think, comes from the way that social media has grown up, and the way that the culture of social media has kind of evolved. It's easy to be uncivil there. It's behavior that's rewarded. Um, Being nasty to somebody, but also, the insular nature of the communities on social media, right? You don't just block somebody or unfriend them. You announce to everyone else that you did it, right? And you get cheers. Thank God you're not talking to that person anymore. One of the things we usually talk about is the need to, and look, I'm a social media power user. I get up in the morning and the first thing I look at is social media, and it's the last thing I do before I go to bed. And so I believe in it, and I think it has tremendous potential and power. But we kind of ask people to recognize that the culture there is broken, and then to pull away from it when you can, right? To consciously interact with people differently, especially in person, than you do on social media. Another big driver is the 24-hour news cycle. The just um, uh, the obsession with the urgency of the 24-hour news cycle. Everything is breaking news. How could everything be breaking news? And normally when you watch, you figure out you're like, that's not breaking. That's been going on for 5 days. But that adds this sense of anxiety and fear to everything, to every issue. I think that drives a lot of civility. And so it's not that you can't consume these things. I mean, I watch a lot of cable news. I think you got to be aware of what's going on there and what the motivation is, and say, well, okay, it's entertaining, maybe it's a little informing, but I'm not going to buy into that culture. I'm not going to be what they're trying to make me into. And there are a lot of other things in our culture right now I think really lend themselves to this kind of behavior, but those are two really, really big ones.
Something happened this week that, I don't know whether to be encouraged yet by it or not, but Fox fired Tucker Carlson and CNN fired Don Lemon. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's two people who live sort of on the extremes and were very divisive in their presentation.
Just strange too, both of them, odd guys.
But they had put good numbers on the board.
Great numbers.
And yet their networks fired them anyway. And I mean, of course, $750 million settlement will get your attention, but still, I'm watching to see if that signals that these cable networks are realizing that people are tired of that sort of constant antagonism. And I think hopefully it's a hopeful sign in the blue back here.
That's an interesting observation. So you feel like they're getting a better version of it than maybe we are. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm too old to even have an opinion about that.
I mean, what I worry about, I have two teenage kids, late teens. What I worry about is um, the spectrum of their diet, right? How much are they able to take in, and how much are they actively seeking, right? Uh, it's too easy now to narrow your diet down to only the stuff that you want to hear and that makes you feel good, right? It makes you feel like you're right. And I worry that that without some of the older established media outlets as part of your diet, that it's harder to create a diet that looks like that. But that's an interesting take on podcasts. I mean, I'm a big podcast fan. I don't find I have the time for that. That's a big investment, but it's good to hear young people are doing it.
One of the dangers, though, is with all these new sources of information is there's no hierarchy of credibility. You know, back when most of us were coming up, getting into the news business was an expensive, elaborate proposition. You had to have printing presses. You had to have FCC licenses and satellite dishes. There was an investment. Now, everybody can be in the news business. You Google something and, one of Steve's articles come up right there next to Bob the blogger from his mom's basement. And we're asking these people, the news consumers, to determine what's credible and what's not, to sort of sort it all out. It's a much more difficult task. In the back. Oh, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
It's hard at this point to offend us, isn't it?
So sometimes I will stop and say, just so I'm clear, I hear you to be saying X. The radio show I host every morning in Detroit, when people call in, often I'll stop before I go back to the guest and say, I think this is what you're saying, or I think this is what you're asking. Tell me if I'm right. But even more than that, I think what we're saying is that in your mind, part of the exercise is to be able to say to yourself, I could do that. Maybe it's not something you're verbalizing all the time, but checking yourself by saying, could I repeat back to this person essentially what they just said, and do it in good faith, and do it with a degree of accuracy. I mean, I think it's more of a self check often than it is like an actual part of the conversation. Then they buy in. You're right. You're right about that.
Well, no, and
So you couldn't prove it wrong, is what you're saying?
so
That's
in that
interesting.
moment, ask them, okay,
Where did you
where
get
did you
it?
hear that? What do you, not in a confrontational way. So, I haven't heard that. Where would I learn more about that? Where to, try to draw them out. Who knows? It may have been right if you couldn't find it wrong. But anyway, what, way in the back here. Oh, mhm. Again, I would give the same answer, as to this question. It's back and forth, asking questions, asking them to verify, or, you know, how did you learn that? We all encounter people like that, and some people may counter you and think that. You go also have to harbor at least some uh, possibility that you may not be right yourself, and so stop and talk to them.
Yeah, but the simple question, where did you learn that? I think is a really wonderful way to say, I'm not sure I believe you uh, or agree, but not saying, hey, I think you're crazy and I'm not going to talk to you. It's saying, just let me understand a little better where this comes from.
You had a question? Yeah.
I actually think they changed between 08 and 16, right? Yeah. So I wrote a column actually before Obama was elected, uh, and when it was uncertain that he would be elected, that said, if this happens, I really expect that the course of dialogue in the country will go in a very dark direction for a long time after he's president. That there would be this kind of backlash, and I wouldn't certainly wasn't the only person who had this thought or who publicly made that kind of guess about things. But yeah, I mean, some of what we're seeing is fear of 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 progress of the change that represented. It's not all of it, and I think there is a danger in assigning that motive to everybody who supports Donald Trump or supports whoever it is or whatever it is. That's not the only thing that's going on, and I think there's a real danger in not really understanding the full appeal of that kind of politics. But there's also a real danger in denying that's
Yeah.
a real fundamental part of it.
Yeah, but there was a lot of things going on along with it. I mean, we came through just a horrific recession where a lot of people lost their homes, their jobs, in their minds, their future. There were a lot of frightened people, and at the same time, you had the rise, you know, of social media, cable networks were getting stronger. You know, it was a terrible confluence of forces. So it's a lot of work, as Steve said, right here. Again, by being civil yourself, you know, sort of noodling along the conversation. And again, I would say one of the critical factors is, you know, make sure you're not being smug and self-righteous in your own opinion. You know, be honest in your own goals, in your own approach.
But we do, you know, we're seeing a lot more of that right now than we normally do. I mean, there's no question that, you know, some of the debates that we're having right now about progress, about recognizing more fully the rights that everybody ought to have, uh, it inspires, you know, a disrespectful response a lot of the time. And I don't think anybody has an obligation to countenance that, right? We don't have an obligation to just take that and say that's okay. I think it's really important to speak up and say, look, I think this is disrespectful of my or someone else's pretty basic rights, and that's not okay. And I'm not going to just let you do that. But I also think it is really important, as Nolan was saying, to do it in a way that keeps the dialogue going. And it's taken me a while to get to that place, but the reason I'm there now is that I don't know what else we would do, right? If you're not going to talk to people who think differently, if you're not going to try to figure out a way um, to understand where everybody's coming from, so that we can all, you know, we can all exist. I don't know what else happens, and I think what we saw on January 6th of 2021 was an example of what will happen. Right, when people lose the ability to feel like they're being heard, when they feel like there is no other option, that's what they resort to. And I don't think any of us wants more of that. Now, I don't agree with, I don't agree substantively with what they were upset about, right? I think they were wrong, but there had to be a better way for them to express that, right? And they didn't feel like there was, and that's the danger that I think we're really playing with fire in this country around right now.
Yeah, and you know, have too much of a tendency to tell people how they should feel, rather than to make a case for why they should feel a certain way. I mean, there's too much force in trying to be forced down on people rather than coaxing folks along. And, you know, we've got to get back to that point where we're, you know, speaking to people's hearts, and instead of, you know, trying to do this in a coercive manner. We could take two more. You had your hand up. Yeah, we'll take you, and then lady here, and then we've got to wrap her up. Well, appreciate it. Thank you. Well, you know, it was bad in the 60s, obviously. It was bad. It was bad then as well. I think the difference is, as I said earlier, that I see is we've lost uh, respect for the structure and the institutions that have held it together. We're too willing to get our way by any means necessary. And so we have groups on both sides of the aisle saying, well, you don't have to, you know, you don't have to pay attention to that, or let's get rid of those rules. So for the moment, you know, we can prevail. And that lack of understanding that for the long term, there's going to be a time when the other party's in charge, and they're going to wield these same, you know, carve-outs to our institutions and our protections. You know,
a lot of the institutions are weakening themselves. I think that's a difference too. Congress is an entirely different institution than it was 20 years ago. The Supreme Court, I spent 5 terms in Washington covering the Supreme Court from 2003 through 2007. I don't recognize the behavior of the justices. I don't recognize a lot of the decision making. You have justices doing things that no justices in history ever did. That causes people to pause and say, well, how much faith should I put in the decisions that they make? And I think that's really dangerous. You know, this is the longest surviving form of government on the planet right now. And it's survived because, you know, the kind of genius of the establishment of those institutions, flaws and all. I mean, lots of flaws from the beginning, right? But the basic structure of our government is it rests on the idea of that stability and good faith, and I just don't see it playing out in quite the same way that it used to, and that it did quite recently. And there have always been kind of ebbs and flows of that, right? There have been times in history when those institutions were weak before, but awful things have happened because of that, right? You know, the Civil War, of course, being the absolute low of that. So my fear is that we're headed toward those awful times. Not that maybe the thing won't survive, but that what it will take for it to survive is something really, really desperate and awful to happen.
So, right here. Understand and try, you know, and try to convey the idea that there are things in the relationship that are much more important than you all agreeing on politics or something else. You're talking about your family, and after the 16 election, I had a cousin, very passionate, he's a college professor, very passionate Democrat, and most of the rest of the family weren't. You know, the rest of the family are Republicans, and she took it very personally that they had voted for Trump, you know, and she had, and she cut herself off, and she, you know, canceled everybody on Facebook or whatever you do. She dropped, I mean, and just isolated herself from her family. And I had a conversation with her. I said, well, yes, they're who they are. You know, they vote the way they are, and they feel politically the way they are, just the way you do. But they're also the people who have been there in your dark moment. And we'll be there again in your dark moment. There's some things much more important than them agreeing with you and voting the same way you do. They didn't cast their vote to hurt you. You know, they cast their vote to express their viewpoint. And I think we have to get beyond this idea of having it be so important to us that other people close to us agree with. You know, it's okay if they gives you something to talk about. We probably have more fun together disagreeing. No.
So I have a question. This is a gorgeous library. Can someone tell me when this was done and why? And
What does that mean? Okay. And is it well used?
it's a time when people are disinvesting from libraries in a lot of communities, and it's really nice to see the opposite happen.
Well, appreciate it.